Well, welcome back to another week of Honey from the Word. Today's lesson is titled Get Back on Your Bike, Dealing with Failure, from the book of Jonah, chapter 3, verses 1 through the first part of verse 3. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah the second time, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and preach to it the message that I tell you. So Jonah arose and went to Nineveh according to the word of the Lord. When you first learned how to ride a bike, think about that. You probably began with training wheels. Eventually, when those were taken off, you struggled at keeping your balance. You had a hard time staying upright. Maybe you fell a few times, scraping your knees or elbows or maybe some other part of your body. At that point, you were learning an important lesson about failure. As you practice, it's likely that one of your parents walked beside you shouting instructions, encouraging you and catching you as you lost balance. You were scared but excited. You looked forward to the time when you would succeed, when you would at last ride free on your own. If you kept at it every day and eventually mastered the riding of the bike or the skill of riding a bike. When we first learned how to ride a bike, we had to fall off many, many times and pick ourselves up and get back on it and try again before we learned how to ride. But as we got older and wiser, we've begun to think that falling off is a bad thing rather than an essential part of the process of achieving our goal. You see, failure doesn't mean that you've reached the end of the line and that success isn't possible. The only time that success is impossible is when you quit. Quitting is final. But continued attempts with commitment and diligence can always be turned into success. Michael Jordan did a basketball commercial where he walks in the arena and the people are chanting, Michael, Michael. He says, I've missed 9,000 shots in my career. I lost almost 300 games. 26 times I've been trusted to take the game-winning shot and I've missed. I failed over and over again in my life. And then he says, that's why I succeeded. Michael Jordan didn't focus on his failures. He focused on his strengths. The Bible records many failures because it records life as it is. You see, the Bible is about real people. Some of the biblical failures are today only remembered for their successes. But before there was success, there was failure. And the more I look at Scripture, I see people whose ministry in the eyes of the world may be considered a failure, but not in God's eyes. Look at Jacob. Jacob lied to his father, stole his brother's birthright and blessing. He failed to live as God intended him to live, and yet God gave him the name Israel, representing God's people. David. Let's consider him for a moment. God made David king, and as king, David commits adultery with Bathsheba. And then he has her husband murdered to hide his failing. Yet, David becomes known as a man after God's own heart. And what about the Apostle Paul? Paul, or Saul as he was known earlier, spent his life persecuting Christians. And then through what you might call an eye-opening experience, Saul, the one who failed, became Paul, the greatest missionary in history. Think about Jonah for a moment. In chapter 1, Jonah is given a chance to be a success for God. He is told what to do, and all he has to do is just obey God and he will be successful. But instead of obeying God, he runs away from what God has called him to do, and he becomes a failure. It's bad enough that he disobeyed God, but then because of his disobedience or failure, he puts other people at risk. A storm begins to rage because of his failure. He is thrown overboard and then swallowed by a big fish. And in the belly of this great big fish, he senses his failure even more. And then we read such words in chapter 2. In my distress, depths of the grave, into the deep, waves and breakers swept over me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head, and on and on. Jonah knew that he was a failure. At this point, he could have given up and died, but he didn't. He got back up on his bike. He cried out to God and asked God to help him. Jonah chapter 2 verse 10 says, "So the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land." As chapter 3 opens, God again calls Jonah to go to Nineveh. He asks Jonah to get back up on the bike and try again. Now, if I were in God's place, or you were maybe, I imagine at this point we'd have had enough of what Jonah had done. Let's find someone else. But God is patient with his prophet. He recommissions Jonah, giving him another chance, and uses him in spite of his failure to obey. If God didn't, none of us could serve. Nearly everyone that God chooses to use has committed sins that would justify dismissal from God's service. And God is telling Jonah to pick himself up and try again until he gets it right. So Jonah arose and went to Nineveh according to the word of the Lord, chapter 3, verse 3. Jonah gets back on his bike and with God's support travels across this extraordinary large city, telling these sinful people that they'd better get their acts together, or in 40 days, boom, they would become history. We still have a problem of believing that God won't give up on us in spite of our past failure or failures. There are untold numbers of people who think that God has given up on them. They think that because they have failed so miserably in the past, fallen so far and so many times, that God could never forgive them or think of using them again. Many think there's absolutely no way that God would ever use such a failure as them. Wrong, wrong, wrong. You see, our God is an awesome God. He has plans for each of us, and we can't fail enough to ever change those plans. He's a God who picks us up and gives us another opportunity to succeed or do it right. In the Bible, we have people running from God, attempting suicide, committing adultery, murder, making false idols, disobeying God, lying and stealing. I mean, pretty much bad stuff. And yet God still used them to accomplish great things. God never gave up on His plans for those people, and He will not give up on His plans that He has for you. It is said that Thomas Edison performed 50,000 experiments before he succeeded in producing a storage battery. When asked if he'd ever become discouraged working so long without results, Edison replied, "Results? Why, I know 50,000 things that won't work." Each one of us will fail at something in our lifetime. Our response is what determines what becomes of our failings. To God, our failings is a lesson learned, an education. God says, good, you've learned what won't work. I'm not giving up on you. Hop on your bike and keep trying. I'm here to support you. The common denominator for people that learn how to deal with failure and hardship in life is that they don't give up. They refuse to focus on the failures and weaknesses and focus upon their strengths. Failure doesn't mean you've reached the end of the line and that success isn't possible. The only time success is impossible is when you quit, because quitting is final. But continued attempts of picking yourself up and getting back on your bike can be turned into success. Just like Abraham, Isaac, David, Jonah, Peter, and many others, you must pick yourself up and get back on your bike. God is not finished with you yet. He still has some great things ahead for you. All you have to do is get back and try again. God's given you another opportunity, and now is the time for you to seize it. Maybe you have failed in the past. Maybe it's been multiple failures, but if you'll trust God and get back on your bike and ask Him and cry out to Him, your best days are ahead if you will just let God use you.